false killer whales, and the lack of addressed population threats. Dr. Baird, welcome.
Great, and thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. Um, Before I get started, I just want to note that the work that I'm going to be talking about is a collaborative effort at Cascadia. Sabre Mahaffey, Annette Harnish, and Michaela Cradafil have been taking the lead on most of the analyses. We have a field team, Colin Cornforth, Mark Moeller, and others that play a critical role for the work we do. The science part that I'm going to talk about is part of a long-term effort, as Felix mentioned, and we've had funding from a lot of different sources over the years. Our primary funding recently has been from the state of Hawaii as part of a NOAA Section 6 grant through the ESA and the Pacific Island Fisheries Science Centers. And we also have a lot of collaborators, particularly with Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center and Southwest Fisheries Science Center, as well as with Pacific Whale Foundation and others. So the US arguably has the strongest protection for marine mammals anywhere in the world, with the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The Marine Mammal Commission, which was established under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, provides oversight for government activities that occur in relation to both of these acts. Now, on the federal government side, for whales and dolphins, science is primarily undertaken through science centers. And in the case of false killer whales in Hawaii, the Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center and the Southwest Fisheries Science Center have been the lead organizations from NOAA. The management activities, though, are undertaken by a different part of NOAA. And in the case of Hawaii, that includes both the Pacific Island Regional Office as well as the NOAA Office of Protected Resources. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the interplay between the science and the management, when it's worked and when it hasn't worked. And also mention also the role of the courts in some of the management actions that have happened. Now, a bit of background about false killer whale science in Hawaii. It actually began in the 1980s. Dan McSweeney, based in Kona, started photo identifying false killer whales and other species of whales and dolphins in 1986, and later provided those photos for our catalogs. And in 1989, Steve Leatherwood and Randy Reeves flew aerial surveys specifically to try to estimate the numbers or count the numbers of false killer whales in several areas in Hawaii, and that work I'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, I started working off Maui in 1999, set up a photo identification catalog for false killer whales, and in 2000 began biopsy sampling false killer whales, primarily for genetic analyses and collaborating with the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Now, in terms of monitoring, in 2000, there was an important step, which is that the observer coverage in the deep set longline fishery for tuna increased up to 20%. And that provided an increased assessment of bycatch of false killer whales in that deep set longline fishery. Now, Joe Mobley from the University of Hawaii had been undertaking aerial surveys primarily for humpbacks in the 1990s, but they were also recording false killer whales and other species of toothed whales and dolphins. And in 2000, he produced a report that estimated the abundance of false killer whales around the main Hawaiian Islands from those aerial surveys. It was an estimate of 121 individuals. Now, that was the first abundance estimate from Hawaiian waters. And when that was combined with the bycatch estimates coming in from the observer program and the longline fishery, it led National Marine Fisheries Service to recognize what was called at that point the Hawaii stock of false killer whales as strategic, which basically meant that the estimated bycatch levels were exceeding the potential biological removal level, a sustainable level bycatch for the population. There were a couple other abundance estimates in the 2000s. In 2003, Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center, well, actually Southwest Fisheries Science Center, led a line transect abundance estimate survey for the entire exclusive economic zone surrounding the Hawaiian archipelago. Estimated 268 individuals, a lot more than the aerial survey estimate from around the main Hawaiian Islands, not surprising given the much larger area. And then in 2005, we produced an estimate for the main Hawaiian Island population based on our photo identification analyses that was very similar to the estimate around the main Hawaiian Islands from aerial surveys. So I'm going to step back here and talk a little bit about what false killer whales are feeding on, because this is really the basis for many of the conservation issues that the populations are facing. This is an alua, a giant trevally. This photo taken off Kona illustrates that false killer whales are feeding on reef-associated game fish. This is a broad-billed swordfish, on the other hand, between two false killer whales. You can see the dorsal fin of one false killer whale here and the back of another one. And this is about a 10-foot long swordfish that's upside down between the two whales. And when you combine information from observations and stranded animals, it turns out that false killer whales are feeding on a wide variety of both reef-associated and pelagic game fish. That we're lucky that false killer whales tend to feed during the day, and they tend to feed on large prey. They bring their prey up to the surface where we're able to get photos and identify them, which makes a big difference in terms of how much we know about what they're feeding on. I will point out one species down near the bottom of the list, Ava, and I'll talk a little bit about that later as it relates to one of the other potential threats for the population. Now, given that they're feeding on all of these species of fish that humans are also targeting, it's not surprising that there's evidence of fisheries interactions. And the first paper that we published on false killer whales in a peer-reviewed journal in 2005 basically was providing evidence that this population around the main Hawaiian Islands was interacting with fishing gear and getting injured as a result. Now, this middle photo is actually from the Long Line Observer Program, shows the hooked false killer whale on the line. And if you look closely, there's an abrasion along the side of the animal that was caused by struggling against that line. The images on the right show three different individuals from our catalog at that time that either had major dorsal fin disfigurements, or the one at the top right, it was missing the dorsal fin entirely. We compared the rate of these dorsal fin disfigurements for other populations, both in Hawaii and elsewhere, of different species of dolphins and small whales, and false killer whales had a much higher rate of these injuries than any of the other populations. Now, at the time, we thought that these interactions were coming from the longline fishery for a couple reasons. One, the longline fishery had an observer program and was reporting interactions, and we really had very little information on what other types of fisheries they might be interacting with in Hawaiian waters, because there's no observer coverage on any of the nearshore fisheries. And at that point, we really didn't know how far offshore the false killer whales around the main Hawaiian Islands went. So it seemed quite plausible that they were going offshore where the longline fishery was occurring. Now, in 2007, the first genetics paper was published based on the biopsy samples that we had been collecting and samples collected by Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And importantly, that provided evidence that there was more than one population of false killer whales in Hawaiian waters. This graphic shows the mitochondria haplotypes and the relationship between mitochondria haplotypes among different sampled individuals. And almost all the individuals sampled around the main Hawaiian Islands share a single mitochondria haplotype, whereas individuals sampled in offshore waters and off Palmyra and other areas had largely different haplotypes. And this provided evidence that there was both a population around the main Hawaiian Islands and an open ocean population. Now, our photo identification catalog in 2008, we published the first paper based on looking at resightings of individuals. We found long-term site fidelity. The photos shown here are of an individual seen in 1988 and 2005, and another one seen in 1998 and 2006. And this was evidence of the individuals around the main Hawaiian Islands were staying around the main Hawaiian Islands. On the right, it shows a social network. And almost all the individuals that we photo identified were linked by association within the same social network, suggesting they're all part of one population, except for one large group that was seen offshore that had no links to any other individuals. And we thought at the time that was evidence of an offshore population. So this was a case where National Marine Fisheries Service, the management side, took the science that was being published, both the genetics and the photo identification, and they recognized both a Hawaii insular population and a Hawaii pelagic population in 2008 in their stock assessment reports. Now, bycatch in the longline fishery from the observer program combined with the abundance estimate for the entire Hawaiian exclusive economic zone led that Hawaii pelagic stock to being considered strategic. But there were no observer programs in any of the nearshore fisheries, so basically there was no bycatch, and the insular population was not considered strategic as a result. There were a lot of other management issues, though, that were becoming obvious for the main Hawaiian Island insular false killer whales by 2009. We published our first paper on persistent organic pollutants in 2009, led by the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. Very small sample size, but 3 out of the 9 individuals we sampled, both the adult males we sampled and one subadult, had levels of PCBs that exceeded health thresholds. And if you look at this top graph, you can see that the females in black have much, much lower levels of PCBs than either the adult males or the subadults, and that's PCBs and DDTs. And that's not surprising given that these organic pollutants are lipophilic. They concentrate in the blubber, and females are able to get rid of their toxin loads through lactation. In the bottom one, it also shows that for PBDEs, which are flame retardants, that subadults had the highest levels. And flame retardants like PCBs are known to potentially cause various health issues and compromise the animal's immune system. Now, I had mentioned that aerial survey that was undertaken in 1989 by Steve Leatherwood and Randy Reeves. That study was never published, but I worked with Randy to put it together, and we published it in 2009. In that aerial survey, false killer whales were the 3rd most frequently encountered species, and groups of over 300 individuals were seen on 3 different days in areas, particularly up here off Kohala, highlighted that by this time were known to be a high density area for the main Hawaiian Island insular population. We had started our satellite tagging work with false killer whales a couple years before this and had found that this area circled was an area where the main Hawaiian Island animals are spending a lot of their time. And the minimum counts from this aerial survey that was undertaken were 380, 460, and 470 individuals, which, if you remember the abundance estimate I mentioned earlier of 123, were about 4 times higher than the abundance estimate. So this paper in particular suggested evidence of a decline. Now, those aerial surveys that I had mentioned that Joe Mobley had been undertaken in the 1990s continued into the 2000s. And Joe provided the data for a report that I produced for the Marine Mammal Commission in 2009. And the aerial survey data showed that for false killer whales, there was a significant decline in sighting rates from the 1990s into the 2000s. And importantly, as I mentioned, they had estimates for other species as well. And these other species showed no consistent declines that could indicate that the decline in false killer whales was due to some difference in sea state or differences in survey design. The other species, some of them went up, some of them went down, but there was no consistent pattern. So this was another line of evidence that the main Hawaiian Island population of false killer whales had declined between the 1990s and the 2000s. Now, in this case, there were several management steps that were taken for this population as a result of the science that was being published. NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, petitioned NIMS in September 2009 to list the Hawaii insular population under the Endangered Species Act. NIMS took action. The science staff basically convened a biological review team, and in August 2010 released a status review, which basically provided evidence that the population around the main Hawaiian Islands was distinct from other populations, and it was significant under the definitions of the Endangered Species Act, and there was evidence both for decline and lots of continuing threats. Now, the management side acted fairly quickly and put together a proposed endangered listing under the ESA, but then things seemed to slow down. And in March 2012, NRDC had to submit a notice of intent to sue to try to encourage action again. And it wasn't until November 2012 that NIMS finally listed the main Hawaiian Island population as endangered, effective December 28th, 2012. Now, one thing that happened in 2012 was the federal election, Obama's second election, and there were rumors at the time that one of the reasons why this final endangered listing was delayed until after the election was just because of the political ramifications of increased or additional protections for whales and how that might influence the election results. So at the time of listing a population as endangered, or within 1 year, if it's not determinable, National Marine Fisheries Service is supposed to also designate critical habitat. And we, anticipating the listing, had analyzed our satellite tag data and actually published a paper that came out half a year before the final listing that basically showed where false killer whales from this population were spending their time and what areas were particularly important. And what we were hoping is that NIMS would then use this information, and when they did the listing or within a year, use it in order to designate critical habitat. Now, nothing really happened. Again, there were delays, and there was another NRDC lawsuit to force action in July 2016, a few years after the original listing. NIMS proposed a rule in November 2017 to designate critical habitat, and then finally in July 2018, 4 years after the original listing, they designated critical habitat for the population. So false killer whale critical habitat, not surprisingly, looks very similar to what the high density areas and satellite tag data show. There are some important carve-outs, though. You can see these areas between Kauai and Niihau, a little area north of Molokai, that are national security exclusions. There are a couple economic exclusions, an area off of Kaina Point on Oahu and off the edge of Penguin Bank. And these were primarily areas where the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management were considering for wind energy development. And so those are outside of the critical habitat for false killer whales. So since then, really, there's just been sustained investment in the science, and that investment has come from National Marine Fisheries Service, and a lot of the science has been undertaken by them, as well as by Cascadia and Pacific Whale Foundation. We published one paper that provided evidence of another population in Hawaii, which is now recognized as the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands population. But there are a lot of other papers published in the years after the ESA listing, and this is just a selection of them. I'm going to talk in particular about two of these as they relate to fisheries interactions. Now, in 2015, although this is the early version that came out in 2014, we published a more comprehensive assessment of dorsal fin injuries and how that varies by age and sex, or by sex, and among populations. By this point, we had information on both the main Hawaiian Island population, now the Northwestern Hawaiian Island population, and the pelagic population. And we found that individuals in the main Hawaiian Island population had a much higher incidence of dorsal fin injuries that were associated with fisheries interactions than either of the other two populations. I had mentioned earlier about 3.5% of individuals in our first publication. Now is up to 9% of individuals had line injuries on the dorsal fin that were consistent with fisheries interactions. Now, we expanded this study with much larger sample sizes from all three populations in a paper that came out last year. And again, like the 2015 study, it showed that individuals from the main Hawaiian Island population have much higher incidence of injuries than the other two populations. One major change from this paper from the previous studies is that we also included mouth line injuries. The idea is that if false killer whales are taking fish off a line, they're most likely to get hooked in the mouth. And so the mouth line injuries should be more frequent than dorsal fin injuries, which they would only get if they're struggling against that line. And that's exactly what we found. 12.8% of the main Hawaiian Island individuals had dorsal fin injuries, but 16.9% of them had mouth line injuries. And when you looked at individuals with both mouth line and dorsal fin photos available, and whether they had one or the other type of injury, it was almost 30% of the individuals from the population that had evidence of surviving fishery interaction. Now, the fishery interaction or fishery-related injuries are widely distributed among the main Hawaiian Island population. This social network shows the presence of 4 different social clusters, which we now recognize. And one of the clusters, cluster 3, 38% of the individuals had some type of fishery-related injury compared to less than 20% for cluster 2. And that's important in terms of understanding how widespread the fisheries interactions are and whether or not it may vary among clusters, given that the tradition of taking fish off a line is probably something that's passed on from mother to offspring. Now, we know that our estimates of injuries are negatively biased, and we know that for a couple reasons. One is that when we have better photo quality and a shorter time interval between resightings, it increases the likelihood of detection of injury. Also, the mouth line injury rates are particularly negatively biased, as those without mouth line or those without injuries have a median proportion of mouth line visible of only 50%, while those with mouth line injuries have a median proportion visible of 80%. It's hard to get both good left hand and right hand mouth line photos, and so we know we're missing a lot of injuries as a result. Now, I don't mean to say that fisheries interactions are the only threats facing this population. This was a drone video that we obtained in October off of Lanai and shows an individual from cluster 4 of this population with entanglement in marine debris. This individual hasn't been seen since, and this line is a loop of floating polypropylene line. It's probably something that's used in dock handling. And how this individual became entangled in this line is unclear, but false killer whales do like to feed on mahi-mahi, and mahi-mahi often associate with floating debris, and we suspect that the animal got entangled in this as a result. Now, this individual has not been seen since the entanglement was documented, but we're hoping that someone will be able to obtain photos and allow us to assess whether it survived and what happened after we documented it first in October. Now, another potential threat to the population is toxoplasma. Toxoplasma is something that infects a wide variety of warm-blooded animals, including humans and marine mammals. Cats are the definitive host of toxoplasma, and it's shed through their feces. The oocytes, which are basically the eggs of this parasite, may persist in the ocean for up to 2 years. And the toxoplasma oocytes will accumulate in filter feeders, so myctophids that are associated with the deep scattering layer, and also ava. And any prey, any predator that feeds on these organisms that have accumulated the oocytes have the potential to be infected by it. Disseminated toxoplasmosis has been known to kill 3 different spinner dolphins based on stranding work by Christy West's lab at the University of Hawaii, and as well as 1 bottlenose dolphin. And when you extrapolate that out to the number of animals that are actually found stranded, it may relate to up to 60 spinner dolphins. Hasn't been documented in false killer whales, but I think it's something that is likely to affect them. And I think the main reason why it hasn't been documented is just that strandings of false killer whales are so few and far between that the record of it just hasn't been documented yet. Now, how's the population doing since it was listed as endangered? We published a paper just a few months ago that combined the photo identification work and the satellite tagging work as a way of assessing population trends. And since the population was listed as endangered, it's been declining at an average of about 3.5% per year. So the big question then is we've got this evidence of fisheries interactions that's been available since well documented since a few years after the population was listed as endangered. We have evidence that the population is declining, and what has been done in terms of management steps since 2013 to mitigate threats from nearshore fisheries interactions. You may think that this is just a slide that's missing some important text, but this is actually the complete list of management actions that have been taken to mitigate these nearshore fishery interaction threats. Now, I'm going to switch to talk now primarily about the pelagic population of false killer whales and another series of management actions that have been taken, and that's through the false killer whale take reduction team. Now, lawsuits forced NIMS to establish this take reduction team, and it was announced in 2010. If you'll remember, it's since 2000, the population was considered strategic, but no action was taken until a lawsuit was forcing NIMS to do so. Importantly, the scope of the team, right when it was announced, only included longline fisheries, even though there were some of the members of the team, myself included, that argued right from the beginning it needed to also include nearshore fisheries. Take reduction teams include members from as many different constituencies as possible. It included commercial fishermen, representatives from the state of Hawaii, Westpac, the Marine Mammal Commission, researchers, and representatives from conservation organizations. Now, the team got together and produced a draft take reduction plan. There's one measure in that draft take reduction plan that was meant to protect the main Hawaiian Islands population. And that was this, if you look at the map on the right, this long line exclusion area around the main Hawaiian Islands. This area would shrink closer to the islands for 4 months of the year. And we proposed, and it was actually implemented, that the long line exclusion area not shrink for 4 months of the year, and instead this outer boundary would provide year-round protection for the main Hawaiian Island population. The other components of the plan that were trying to reduce bycatch of the pelagic population, the plan would require circle hooks. Circle hooks should reduce the hooking of false killer whales, and that's because when a fish bites a circle hook, it's most likely to get jaw hooked, and false killer whales would often, when they're depredating catch, would leave the head behind. So with circle hooks, it should reduce the likelihood of one getting hooked in the first place. And then two other gear changes. One is that the branch line connecting the circle hook to the main line would have a minimum 2.0 millimeter diameter, and the circle hook itself would have a maximum diameter and a required or maximum pull strength, and that would make the hook the weakest link in the interaction. So if a false killer whale got hooked, if the circle hook didn't actually stop it from getting hooked in the first place and struggled against the gear, it would have a chance of straightening out the hook or breaking the hook and getting free of the gear. Now, there were a couple other requirements. One is expansion of training of owners and captains once per year, and a recommendation for crew to put tension on the gear to try to straighten the hooks. There was also what you can see in this map, a southern exclusion zone, and that southern exclusion zone was established primarily to provide incentives to fishermen to come back to the table if the take reduction plan wasn't working. So this is a draft take reduction plan that the team presented to NIMS, and NIMS then was basically to turn that plan into an actual take reduction plan. They put it out for public comment. The public comment period closed October 2021. Again, no action was taken, and so they had to be sued again. And as part of that agreement, they finally published or agreed to publish plan by the end of November. And the final take reduction plan was published at the end of November of 2012, effective February 27th, 2013. Now, the plan did require circle hooks with maximum 4.5 millimeter wire diameter, but they removed the pull strength criteria, and I think that was one of the fatal flaws of the plan that was put out. It only took a few years before there was pretty conclusive evidence that the plan wasn't working. Information that was presented to the team in 2017 showed that the interaction rates had remained unchanged. There was no significant decrease in the serious injury and mortality rate. False killer whales were still the most frequently reported cetacean species hooked or entangled in the fishery. It actually increased from 44% before the take reduction plan to 59% after the take reduction plan. The interaction rates were increasing, which is either hooking or entanglements, and the mortality rate was actually lower before the take reduction plan than after the take reduction plan. So overall, serious injury and mortality was slightly higher before the plan than after the plan, but with increased interaction rates and an increase in effort in the fishery, the bycatch had increased substantially. So one of the things that also happened, and I think this was largely in order to avoid the consequences of the closure of the southern exclusion zone, is there was a shift in fishing effort from inside the exclusive economic zone to outside the exclusive economic zone. So the mortality and serious injury inside the EEZ went down for a while before it started to go back up, whereas outside the EEZ it increased dramatically as a result of the shift in effort. So similar to the investment in science related to insular false killer whales, was also sustained investment by NIMS and by Cascadia into undertaking research on pelagic false killer whales. And this produced a number of different publications and reports on this population. One important step that has been taken in the last couple years by National Marine Fisheries Service is that the Hawaii pelagic stock has been broadened so that it's not just being assessed inside the exclusive economic zone, but using sample data, telemetry data, sighting data, and bycatch. That the new assessment area or management area has been defined. That includes what's thought to be the entire range of the population. And that allows for a direct comparison of bycatch in the U.S. fleet compared to the entire transboundary stock abundance rather than just the abundance inside the EEZ. There's also an effort that's been undertaken quite recently, and I believe this work may now be in press in a peer-reviewed journal by the Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center, and that's to try to estimate non-U.S. bycatch for this population. This study uses Global Fishing Watch data and for various countries and effort data based on hooks. These are all the different countries that fish inside this assessment area. And from this, they're able to estimate the total number of individuals that are serious injured or killed from non-U.S. fisheries. And this is important because it's a transboundary stock. So there have been a couple efforts led by the Science Center to improve our understanding of bycatch and the effects of the bycatch on the entire population. And from the non-U.S. fisheries, an average of about 4.4 false killer whales are thought to be seriously injured or killed per year, in addition to the 47 in the U.S. longline fleet. So not a huge increase, but importantly takes into account other sources of mortality other than just the U.S. longline fishery. Now, I think there's four main flaws or fatal flaws of the take reduction plan as it was implemented back in 2013. As I mentioned right from the beginning, bycatch in U.S. non-longline fisheries was not part of the team mandate, and there are other U.S. fisheries that do interact with false killer whales inside the EEZ that are largely being ignored. There was no pull strength requirement for hooks in the final take reduction plan, which basically allowed fishermen to just come up with hooks that were actually much stronger, even though they met the hook diameter requirements. Bycatch in the non-U.S. longline fisheries were ignored until now. It's now been taken into account, as I mentioned. And importantly, reliance on observers for determining mortality and serious injury rates when there's likely an observer effect. And it's been well documented in other fisheries that when there's an observer on board, fishermen do things differently than when there's no observer on board. And that may mean that they're going to fish in areas where they think they're less likely to encounter false killer whales, or otherwise behave differently in a way that the estimated injury rates may actually be higher than what or the real injury rates may actually be higher than what's being estimated. So, what are the reasons or some of the likely reasons why there's been no significant management actions taken since 2013? And for the main Hawaiian Island population, fisheries interactions were known as the most serious threat since 2014, but which fisheries were responsible was unknown. And that's simply because there's no observers in any of those fisheries. And I think that the data uncertainty has limited any action on the part of NIMS to try to mitigate those interactions. Now, an administration that was basically opposed to new regulations, the first Trump administration limited any real action from 2017 to 2021. But in the last administration, that was not the case, and action could have been taken. Things could have been sort of lined up ahead of time. But the needed regulations for both the take reduction plan and for the main Hawaiian Island false killer whales would impose restrictions on fishermen, which is just politically unpopular. And I think the individuals at the NIMS management side were just not willing to take those types of actions. And of course, now there's a new administration that's also opposed to new regulations. And so I think any serious management action in the next 3.5 years is extremely unlikely. So the population's declining, but the science is continuing, and this definitely provides some hope for me, anyways. In particular, the increase in the number of graduate students that have been working on false killer whales in Hawaii in recent years. In the last couple months, one PhD student at the University of Hawaii finished her dissertation that includes work on false killer whale acoustics, and a master's student at University of California, San Diego, using passive acoustic localization to study foraging behavior. And there's 3 current PhD students, one at Oregon State University and 2 at the University of Hawaii, that are working with false killer whales, either with tag data, drone data, or samples collected from stranded animals and biopsy samples. And all of this new science, I think, will play an important role. But importantly, it also represents that the body of individuals that are invested in and involved in false killer whale science and the related management issues is increasing, and that definitely provides some hope for the future, I think. Now, I want to end on a slightly more upbeat note, and in particular, the role of citizen science in both understanding how the population is doing and the threats that the populations are facing. Citizen science has been an important part of our work right from the beginning, with people who work on the water or play on the water that have cameras taking photos and contributing those photos. And that can play a major role in being able to understand how these groups within the main Hawaiian Island population are doing in particular, but also for fishermen or people who get offshore may encounter individuals from the pelagic population as well. So maybe I'll leave this up here, and we could move on to any questions people have.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. Really appreciate that. And yes, we'd like to open it up for questions. So the first person, you can just shout it out. And then after that, just please raise your hand. So.
Hey, my name is Frederick Smith. I was wondering, outside of this official group, like including the longline fishermen, everything that's been working on this, the take reduction plans and all that stuff, has there been any other effort to meet with fishermen to see if there's any other solutions that we can kind of come up with to like kind of work with their concerns and kind of maybe try and bring more of them on board?
Yeah, well, the take reduction team mechanism, I think, is a great one in theory, because it brings fishermen to the table, and most of the meetings, all the initial meetings were all in-person meetings, and a lot of the ideas for potential solutions came from the fishermen themselves. So I think that mechanism within the management scheme is a good one. I think the main problem is that the fishermen that were fishing near shore were not involved in the early steps. I certainly would support the establishment of a take reduction team to bring nearshore fishermen to the table. We published one paper in 2021 that analyzed all of our satellite tag data in relation to all the commercial marine license data from the state-run fisheries. And the title of that paper was actually Bringing the Right Fishermen to the Table. The idea was that the likelihood of interactions between false killer whales and fishermen are not going to be uniformly spread around the islands. Instead, it's going to really, some individual fishermen are much more likely to have interactions than others. We wanted to try to figure out which fishermen were likely to have those interactions, and the state of Hawaii, as part of their Section 6 funding, was going to be doing more targeted outreach with fishermen that fish in those areas. So I think more of that is needed, and that paper we published in 2021 was one step along the way to identify which fishermen to talk to.
All right, thank you for that. Felix, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you for the talk. It was very informative. Towards the beginning of the presentation, there was a graphic on one of the papers that the PPEs and the DDTs were significantly lower in the females, and the reasoning behind that was because of the lactation and the ability to offload that fat. Now, has it been studied or found that the offspring of the false killer whales to which are consuming that milk, if that transfers over to them?
Yeah, and I will mention there's another paper. Let me just see if it's on one of the slides I showed. There's another paper that was published in 2020 by Michaela Cradafil, and it basically is an updated version of the here it is here, the life history and social structures, drivers of persistent organic pollutant levels and stable isotopes in Hawaiian false killer whales. And if anyone wants a copy of that, I'd be happy to send it. What that paper showed is, with a much larger sample size, is that every adult male and about a third of the adult females in the population have levels of PCBs that are high enough to cause health issues. And the third of the adult females that have such high levels are probably ones that are post-reproductive. Female false killer whales go through menopause and stop reproducing in their 40s, but may live into their 60s. And so those females would have continued then to increase their toxin loads without getting rid of them to their offspring. But the other thing is that a firstborn offspring is going to have, on average, much higher levels of persistent organic pollutants than subsequent born offspring. And it's possible that some of those females with very high levels may have just never been able to reproduce. They could have been firstborn offspring, and thus started off with a really high toxin load. We do know in some cases, and I'd have to get back into the paper to see the details, that the levels are going to vary based on the birth order, and yeah, sorry, and maybe if I didn't capture all of your question, maybe you can just repeat that last part, because
I was just curious to see if it was studied to see the levels in the offspring, if like the transfer is 1-to-1, 10%, or like how much of that those toxins stay in the offspring.
Yeah, well, I think that if you look at the females' levels overall, that they're able to get rid of a huge proportion of their toxin burden every time they have a successful calf, and so the female levels are, I think, so any calf is going to end up with a really high toxin burden fairly early on, and how how high those levels are really going to depend on, again, whether they're the firstborn or subsequent born. But even a situation where, let's say, the female gives birth to a calf and the calf doesn't survive more than a couple months, then the female's levels are going to be high, and they're going to have more to pass on to their offspring.
All right. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question, Felix. Okay, Yusha, please go ahead and mute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Baird. Thank you for the great presentation. Just curious from your experience, like working with captains and fishermen, what would you say is like the general attitude towards reducing bycatch? Um, and do you think it's too late to bring nearshore fishermen to the table? And like, what would that look like moving forward?
I'll say on the take reduction team, some of the longline fishermen that have been members of the team over the years have been extremely motivated to try to solve the problem. And I don't think fishermen want I don't think they want to hook an animal for various reasons, which include they don't want to lose their gear, they don't want to lose the time. So if there's ways of reducing the likelihood of an animal getting hooked in the first place, or even stepping back one, a way of reducing the likelihood that it's going to depredate gear, that's highly motivating for fishermen. Uh, the the reason why we published that paper that I mentioned earlier about bringing the right fishermen to the table was because there's a lot of nearshore fishermen in Hawaii, and I would say probably the vast majority of them have never had a false killer whale hooked on their gear, and so they have to have some personal experience with it, I think, to be motivated to try to solve the problem or even recognize there is a problem. So I think that the only way to do that is to really try to reach out to as many different fishermen as possible, but also to ones that fish in these areas where we estimated that the individual fishermen were going to have the highest levels of interactions. I don't know if that answered both parts of your question or not.
Yeah, just being aware of like how the lack of enforcement power, how likely do you think future gear innovations can solve this issue if people are not enforcing it?
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention in relation to the longline fishery is that the observer coverage, which I had mentioned was up to 20% back in 2000, has been steadily declining the last few years and is expected to be phased out entirely, perhaps by 2026. And what's going to replace it, at least in part, is electronic monitoring, and in particular video monitoring. And I think for the longline fishery, having electronic monitoring on 100% of the fleet will be an important way of assessing what the interaction rates are, but also what the compliance is with the gear requirements and the handling that should be occurring. Uh, there has been some discussion among some individuals within the state of Hawaii and in the research community about the importance of trying to get some of this video monitoring on vessels that are fishing in areas where around the main Hawaiian Islands where the high overlap is likely to be occurring. And I think that would be a more cost-effective and more practical way of trying to monitor interactions in those high overlap areas than to put observers out there. You're absolutely right that there's not much enforcement, and something like video electronic monitoring, I think, is one way to document what's happening in a way that's less intrusive for the fishermen. It's not like they have to have an observer on board. But also a way that's still going to provide some information. And I think you asked whether it's too late. I don't think it's too late. I think something can and should be done, given the population decline. If some steps aren't taken, then the outlook for the main Hawaiian Island population, I think, is grim.
Thank you for your hopeful answer.
All right.